Now, it's pretty much been considered conventional wisdom that when you start to get older, you tend to get more conservative. And when you're younger, of course, you're more idealistic and a little bit more progressive. In fact, there is that old saying that says exactly that. Oh, don't worry, in a few years or when you actually grow up and you become an adult, you'll end up being more conservative. Now, I always thought that was nonsense, and it appears that I'm, of course, right. I know, shocker. Well, if I am, you ask, well, then how come it seems that older people, for the most part, with, of course, notable exceptions, fairly conservative, tend to vote for Republicans more than anything? I mean, again, you have the massive right wing Trump voting boomers, but you also have in the Democratic Party more conservative, less conservative, of course, than the Trump voters, but conservative Democrats who are angling for people like Joe Biden, who are not transformational change candidates, right? And of course, a lot of the commonality is that they're 65 and up and tend to be more conservative. Now, the question there is, how did a generation who lived through, for example, being the greatest generation, tend to end up becoming so right wing? Now, what if it's not because they got more conservative with time, right? But instead, that those who are conservatives ended up outliving the more progressive members of that generation, for the most part. Now, that would also explain why there are a lot of great progressives in that generation, but not compared to how many conservatives there are in that generation. You think about it, right? Now, also think about the demographics of a lot of the voters, right? Older voters specifically. Now, millennials were an incredibly diverse generation, right? We're significantly more diverse than previous generations, right? But when you look at seniors, when you look at the people who are voting, who are generally polled by mainstream media, landlines, etc., you tend to see a lot more white people who are more conservative. And look, even those who are black tending to be more conservative. Why is that? I think, and this is an interesting theory that had come out from a study featured by the Washington Post, Monkey Cage blog. It was actually posted last year, but I think it's really relevant because we are getting closer and closer to the Democratic primaries, and of course, demographics are playing a big role in conservative or conservative Democrat versus progressive Democrat within the Democratic Party, as well as the election coming up between Donald Trump and whoever the Democrats end up having as a nominee. So now, last year, they explained this by simply saying that it's because progressives generally tend to be poorer, and when you're poor, you tend to die earlier. I mean, that seems incredibly simple, but it's something that I had never considered. So, when reading that, it's just, it kind of like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Now, they explain that political participation of the poor is overall lower because of things like poverty, bad health, and other factors. And also, they pointed out that millions of impoverished Americans also die prematurely because of a lot of these factors. Now, for instance, in 2015, research funded by the National Institute of Health and Social Security Administration revealed that since 1990, among the bottom quarter of Americans with the least education, life expectancy has either stagnated or had decreased. And that is, of course, over 40 million people. Now, who do benefits, I should say, who do the policies of people like Bernie Sanders, Mike Gravel, and even Tulsi Gabbard tend to benefit most? People who are poor. Now, add to this negative trend the fact that mortality among the poor increases during middle age. Now, why is that important? Why is that relevant? Well, middle age tends to be when citizens get more active in politics. So if a lot of progressives or people who are more liberal have all these health issues by the time they hit middle age and end up dying sooner, then they're less active in the political process than, say, their more conservative or affluent peers. their votes get counted. They continue to live and vote for conservative candidates, more hardcore right wingers, while there is no counter to that, or at least the counter to that is less because there just happen to be less of them around because they ended up dying through the illness or, injury or, the effects of poverty. Now, the premature disappearance of the poor, they explain, then occurs precisely at the moment when they would be expected to reach their participatory peak in society, but do not live long enough to achieve that milestone. And of course, they explain how race factors in heavily into this. Since white people suffer proportionately less from poverty than non-white people, they tend to live longer and in better health, which is conducive to political and other civic activism. And for a party, for example, like the Democrats, which happen to rely on African Americans, that is utterly devastating. In fact, even more devastating numbers here. According to a 2017 CDC study, African Americans lag in both lifespan and health. For blacks 18 to 64, data showed that they were at a higher risk of early death than white people. And the study said these findings are generally consistent with the previous reports that use the term weathering. Now, what's weathering? Weathering suggests that blacks experience premature aging and earlier health decline than whites, and that this decline in health accumulates across the entire lifespan and potentially across generations. Leandris Liebert, director of the CDC's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, said that this happens as a consequence of psychosocial, economic, and environmental stressors, which a lot of course, is brought upon living in poverty. And as the authors of the study discussed, age and lifespan disparities can become self-perpetuating. And that's, I think, even the most disastrous part about this. You're poor, you die early, while more affluent people vote to keep themselves affluent from getting taxed and doing things like, for example, healthcare for everybody, Medicare for all, right? I've already got insurance. The heck with everybody else. And screw them. I don't want to pay for their healthcare. I want to pay for my healthcare through my insurance company. So, they tend to not address income inequality, which results, of course, in poor people not getting the help that they need, living through these socioeconomic issues like massive income inequality, no help, massive student loan debt, unable to go to a doctor because they can't afford insurance or their copays, and you end up dying earlier. Poverty, here's the thing, poverty pays interest, right? Or charges interest. So the difference is if you don't, for example, get a tooth pulled, right, this year, next year you end up getting a root canal, right? You don't get your back taken care of. You end up having massive back surgery later on in life. Or, you end up not, just all sorts of different smaller things that as you get older blow up into larger health issues that could end up in many cases being fatal, where they just couldn't get health care when they were, when they, or had been able to see a doctor earlier. They weren't able to do that. So those health problems turned fatal later on, leaving them, of course, out of the political process. I mean, incredibly disastrous, right? This is all while affluent conservatives tend to continue to live and vote conservative. And so this creates just a gigantic vicious cycle that stacks the deck even more aggressively against the poor. And that's why it's so difficult to get this system to change. Older progressives are just simply outnumbered by members of their own age group that are still there, that are still conservative. Because a lot of their progressive peers, unfortunately, succumb to poverty and premature death. So in reality, it's not really, the adage is not true that people grow more conservative as they grow older. Maybe some do, of course. I'm not saying that people don't ever change. But I think the biggest factor is that those who survive tend to be better off. And they tend to live longer and therefore have a much larger impact on our politics. And that's, of course, we can change this. right? Now, young people, and it requires younger people getting involved. Unfortunately, young people still don't get involved when they're, between the ages of 18 and 24. They don't vote as often as people who are 35 or older in that middle age, and they need to. They need to get involved in politics so that we can end this disastrous trend and start moving towards a more progressive future. And thankfully, Bernie Sanders is one of those people who can galvanize the young. But guys, you've got to get out there. You've got to get involved in this system so that you can actually start to change this trend. Buck the old system and change it for the future. We can end this cycle, but we can only do it together. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.